All right, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap Podcast. I am your host, David Parsons, excited to bring you another episode, another great conversation. My guest today is Daegan Miller. He has an awesome book called This Radical Land, A Natural History of American Dissent. We get to talk about climate crisis, but even bigger than that, we get to talk about our connection to the earth. Plenty of hippie stuff for you hippie lovers out there on today's show. And by that I mean, you know, why should it be hippie? Why should we denigrate something like having a connection to the land? Maybe that's the fucking problem. Maybe the hippies were right. Maybe the hippies and the environmental wackos of the 90s and the tree huggers, maybe all those people are going to be fucking vindicated by history. Vindicated by history? Vindicated by history. Sorry, it's early. So this conversation today is about that, and it hits home for me because I live in Ventura County. The last few days in Ventura County have been pretty gnarly. We got a mass shooting. We had a mass shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks that killed 12 people. Part of something, phenomenon of mass shootings that I'm just fucking numb about. It's not even on the news anymore. I mean, it got overshadowed by the fact that Thousand Oaks and surrounding areas set on fire on the same day as the mass shooting. So, you know, that confluence of like the natural and the social is a big topic of today's show. And what I mean by that is it's the same sickness. The mass shootings and climate change absolutely are connected. They're part of an attitude and an ideology that's a big part of the development of this country, but it's not just the United States. But the United States, I think, is the worst example of it. This attitude of that the earth is ours to take, it's disposable, that translates into us thinking that human beings are disposable. And I absolutely think that, you know, in order to have an honorable relationship to each other, we have to have an honorable relationship to the earth, which is something that Daegan and I get into on this conversation. So, you know, the mass shooting stuff in Thousand Oaks is, part and parcel of, the culture of the United States. And Thousand Oaks is certainly emblematic of a certain kind of white, suburban, patriarchal, misogynist, pro-police, pro-war culture. Thousand Oaks is not a great place, folks. I don't mean to shit on the place when it's down, but Thousand Oaks is a place that I've always associated with the worst elements of American suburbanization. So, like, there's a great book called Building Suburbia by Dolores Hayden, where she kind of lays out this idea that the suburbs are kind of the apotheosis of American ideology, and it's certainly on the surface in Thousand Oaks, where you have lots of really expensive private schools, kids being dropped off in luxury SUVs, hyper-competitive, hyper-capitalist culture, and really, you know, what I would associate as like the kind of like toxic culture of the suburbs. And it's kind of crazy that we've had this discourse in America. I mean, everyone remembers the movie American Beauty, but it's just one example. There are lots of like cultural examples of how we all, we all understand that the suburbs are fucked, and the suburbs create people that are empty, and the suburbs don't have any values. The suburbs are places that are racist. The suburbs are places that are emblematic of that really unsustainable attitude we have towards our natural resources. I mean, read James Howard Kunstler's Long Emergency. That's the book that kind of got me into thinking about the suburbs as the real heart of the apocalypse and the real heart of our shitty relationship to the earth. So the fact that these mass shootings pop off in the suburbs, and the fact that these fires are happening in California where, you know, despite, you know, of course, you know, Trump makes this point, but the land has been mismanaged. Don't listen to Trump. Listen to Mike Davis. You know, read Mike Davis's stuff. City of Quartz is just one example. I'm using that for my book in LA right now at Sunset. Sunset and Emerson is a class I'm teaching right now about the development of Los Angeles. It's a nightmare. And I can't help thinking and making connections between the kind of awful attitudes we have towards nature, towards animals, and the awful attitudes and destructive violence we perpetrate against each other. So the connections between the natural and the social are things that my guest today is very concerned with. His book is called This Radical Land, A Natural History of American Dissent. He's got a really great kind of take on the different ways that Americans have resisted capitalism. And not just resisted capitalism in the sense of unions and things like that, but resisted capitalism's larger crime against nature, against humanity. and really about kind of the relationship, the idea that capitalism attacks nature and attacks humanity, and how people have throughout American history stood up against that idea. And so, Daegan Miller's got some really great ideas. I hope that you enjoy this episode. I hope that you continue to think about the stuff that we're thinking about on the show, which is kind of how we think about the climate crisis as part of the larger crisis of humanity, and how we connect that to what the left is doing. So we talk about today like eco-socialism, green anarchism, these different traditions, and I think those different traditions are worth taking a look at. The left right now, the people that get the most attention are kind of like the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, figures like that. I think all of them are really important. But I think there's something bigger that we need to attack. And there's a poison, right? And the poison is connected to the mass shootings and connected to the climate crisis, connected to our endless wars in the Middle East. This is deep stuff. I don't have the answers to these things. But when I saw the mass shooting in Thousand Oaks happen and the fire happen the same day, people running for their lives here, scratching their heads, why is this happening? There are reasons why this is happening. I mean, capitalism is the big one, right? But it's not enough to just say capitalism. We have to understand the kind of rot at the core of us and what capitalism has done to us, turned us against nature and turned us against each other. Okay, so what else is going on this week? We've got bonus episodes coming with Justin Rogers Cooper, who right now has the #1 comment in the New York Times on the article about Amazon. We talked about Amazon on our episode about The Office last week. So next week we'll have a bonus episode with Justin. And if you can contribute to our show at all, do that, please. You can go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. That's how you sign up for the bonus episodes. That's how you get to listen to me and Justin. We took a deep dive on gender and race as related to the mass shooting phenomenon. So if you want to listen to that, go subscribe to the show and you'll get access to all our bonus stuff, all Nostalgia Trap content. And check out nostalgiatrap.com. It has all the episodes for free. Thanks so much for listening to the show. I hope you enjoy this. This was a conversation I really enjoyed having. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Here is me talking with Daegan Miller. Daegan, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. It's starting to get cold. We just moved to Massachusetts and from the Midwest, and it's nice to get used to the New England fall again.
What made you move to Massachusetts?
Well, I grew up on the New York-Massachusetts border,
okay.
On the New York side.
Yeah.
And my wife did AmeriCorps out here in Western Massachusetts, and then she got her master's at Smith College, and we've been trying to get back since like 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And finally she got a great job offer. My job is portable, and so we uprooted everything, packed up enormous U-Haul, and in like August drove.
Oh, so you just got there?
Yeah, we haven't been here very long.
Yeah.
It was a very quick turn. She got the job offer in like mid-June, and we were like, okay, I guess let's do it.
Wow, our lives are on very similar tracks right now because it was a year and a half ago. My wife got a job out here in California, where I'm originally from, and we've been living in New York for many years.
Yeah, I thought you were in New York.
Yeah. And so we came out here, and she has a full-time job at a community college out here, and I'm the guy that's like working at a million different jobs and trying to figure out what to do because the academic labor market is so fucked up and all that. Yeah.
Right.
Sound familiar?
Just the same old normal story of.
Yes. So is this kind of a homecoming for you then to come back to this territory?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were in Madison, Wisconsin. I'd gotten a postdoc out there.
Yeah.
And Madison's a great town. Wisconsin's beautiful in a lot of ways. I really got into the prairie. I'm a big runner, and going for runs through the prairie was amazing. But it just never felt like home, know. And there's something about that, as wonderful as it is. There's just something about the way that home feels that.
Well, what are I feel like there are. I'm guessing because of the stuff I know about your work that home probably has something to do with the natural landscape too. Is that part of it?
So that's actually entirely it.
Yeah. I mean, I say that because for all the years that I was in New York City, it never felt like home. And the way I like to describe it to people is that it was the light and the sun and the angles of the sun.
Yeah.
And in California, that was what I identified home was kind of a feature of a visual and sensory feature of the natural landscape. Yeah.
It's funny. I would actually say I've done a lot of backpacking in California, and I would say that too, that like there's something special about California light that's not like, definitely not like the Midwest, definitely not like the East Coast, not like Oregon or Washington. It's like its own character.
And it's a memorable character, and you actually I know the same sun I see in Las Vegas, actually, like in the out in the desert. I remember taking it the first time I took a trip from New York to Las Vegas. That contrast was really, I was like, oh, there's that sun, sun.
Yeah.
So what is it? So what is it in Massachusetts that or upstate New York for you that is kind of the feature?
I think one of the I feel like one of the defining aspects of my life is that I'm a country boy. Like I was born in a rural area. I've lived until I went to Cornell. So Ithaca, I got my PhD at Cornell. Ithaca is a town of 30,000. And that was by far the biggest town I had ever lived in. I was like, there's too much going on here. I need to move outside of town. There are cars and there are ambulance sirens, and it sort of drove me a little crazy. So I've always lived, in rural areas, and I've basically always lived in the woods. And the woods in the Midwest are very different than the woods out here. And so for me, coming back to mixed oak, hickory, maple, beech forests, they have a smell. The leaves have a look. The way the light sort of filters through the leaves it gets back to the light. There's something the sound of the woods is different in the Midwest than it is out here. So all of it just, this overwhelming sensory, almost like Proustian sense of you're smelling it, you're tasting it, you're seeing it, and it all just feels right to me.
It becomes a part of your identity in a lot of ways, right?
In a way I hadn't realized, because I traveled, so I grew up in New York, I went to college in Vermont, then I lived in Maine, and then back to New York for grad school, and so I traveled around a bunch and lived in a bunch of different places in the Northeast, and I guess it wasn't really until moving to the Midwest that I was sort of I was taking this whole side for granted. I just never really realized how important it was to me until we got out to the Midwest. And now, I would say, one of the things I deeply miss about the Midwest is the way the prairies look this time of year. They're starting to, we get great foliage out here in the East, but the prairies turning, this lovely brown and golden, and then the asters get really purple. And they have their own sort of spicy smell that's not like hayfields out here or anything. I do really miss that.
It's weird. It's the absence that makes you realize. Because when I'm away from the ocean, it feels weird to me. It feels I'm like, what that pressure valve that the ocean gives me, that relief of going there and kind of. For me, it's just going and contemplating the infinite, and staring at the ocean is infinity to me. And especially the way, again, the combination of the sun with the ocean is that. And it really feels like a loss when it's not there, for sure.
Well, I think there's something really wonderful and deeply ethical about that, cultivating that sort of sensibility, right? That sort of ability to appreciate something that's so vastly different from us. And yet, sort of constitutive at the same time, right?
What made you have those kinds of thoughts? And in other words, how did you bridge kind of being a nature boy, country boy growing up, and that turning into being the academic who's going to kind of take that apart? Because I know that so your book, we'll get to, is an awesome and really unique work called This Radical Land. And one of the people you write about is Thoreau, who I think of as maybe one of the figures that comes to mind the most when people think about bridging like nature and being intellectual. So how did that process happen for you? That's a big question. I'm sorry.
It's so my background, maybe it's obvious just by looking at me, but like I'm the child of hippies, right? I was born in 1980, right? So sort of like, and my mom, I sort of describe it that like my mom was sort of Joan Baez. If you think about my parents as music, my mom was sort of Joan Baez and my dad was Led Zeppelin.
Oh wow!
Like
yeah.
It's an interesting mix, right? So like, and I grew up in this, rural area, but we always had tons and tons and tons of books in the house, tons of art. My dad never finished college, but he was a musician though, and he taught me. He was he still plays. He's a jazz bassist. And between the two of them, they just taught me an awful lot in their own, like never directly, right? It was always sort of very indirect and sort of modeling, but about, the beauty of literature, the importance of thinking and of appreciating things and listening, especially music, right? Like listening really carefully to something. And so like, when I was growing up, like, it just seemed pretty seamless, like you'd go out and mess about in the woods for like hours and hours and hours. And then like come home and like there'd just be books everywhere and be like, oh, I'm gonna read, I'm gonna pick up. I remember like my mom giving me War and Peace when I was like 11, and I read like 200 pages and was like, I can't, this is too much for like I can't, and like, but and then she was like, okay, well maybe you should start with Dostoevsky then and reading Crime and Punishment, and like it totally rocked my. I think it probably actually short-circuited something in my brain.
I think that there have been a couple people on this program who've talked about encountering Dostoevsky at a young age and kind of like fucking it up. Yeah.
Oh, it was. I could feel myself turning into Raskolnikov. It was terrifying. I actually didn't finish the book the first time I read it because I thought I was going crazy. I reread it when I was much like maybe 24. And same thing, I finally had to just I was living in a cabin at the time. So I just locked myself in the cabin with a bunch of alcohol.
Yeah.
And like just drank and read that thing as fast as I could. And I was like, I don't know what's going to happen when I open the cabin door. Like, I might be crazy when I'm done with this book.
That's such a romantic vision and such a and like I love that you've given that gift. I know a lot of young people listen to this program that's something that I feel like an experience that people have less and less is the experience of being locked in a cabin with a bunch of booze and a Dostoevsky novel and kind of like coming to terms with yourself in that way. Yeah. It feels like our, social media environment doesn't really even give us the space to even contemplate doing something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of ambivalent about social media. I joined Twitter about 2 years ago. I joined when I left the academy in part because I wanted to stay in contact with some of the ideas. And like, as ambivalent as I am about Twitter, like I'm also on it all the time. It's just become addictive. I've met a lot of good people through Twitter. Like I found a lot of great podcasts. That's how I found your podcast. Yeah. It was like, oh, like what is this nostalgia trap with Marx playing a guitar? That seems like something. But it's, I mean, there is something about the loss of a sort of contemplative life, and I think that contemplative life really requires, and it doesn't have to, I want to be clear, like, it doesn't require, like, my own trajectory is really rural, right? And in some ways really privileged in like, we didn't have any money growing up and we'll never have any money, but like, having some space and some sort of time to be by myself, and not everybody has that. Yeah. And it doesn't have to happen in a rural place, but
and I don't think I like to necessarily frame the technological conversation in a kind of Luddite way. To me, it's just the ambivalence comes from, well, this is just the world we live in, and that's that, and I can't really fight against it. There's something there's something devastating about that part of it that is just kind of accepted. But at the same time, I think that it becomes. I used to be the person. When I left for New York when I was 23, 24 years old, I was really into kind of being in the woods and meditating. Like I love to just kind of sit silently in the woods for as long as possible. And even when I got to New York City, I was going to Central Park, and like finding places where you can hike in Central Park and like the Ramble. There's like there are big sections that are pretty wild in there, and that's exactly what it was designed for. But slowly, as my life in graduate school in New York City accelerated and social media became the kind of those times meditating in the woods became less and less, and to the point where, especially in New York City and in the kind of literati circles I was around, like that kind of stuff, there's almost a disdain for it, like going and like, meditating in the woods, which is maybe is another cultural issue, but. Yeah, well, I mean, there's something, so you mentioned Thoreau earlier, and this is something that I feel like I keep coming back to in like both my own writing, but also just sort of like the daily thinking is like the politics of removal and withdrawal, and of disengage, non-engagement or even disengagement, and like all of those things have, in certain political spheres, have like a really negative connotation. Yeah, totally.
But in sort of like, in some ways, like in anarchist politics, it's actually really important, right, to be able to pull out. And there's something that's ultimately like small d, radically democratic in saying like, I don't want to be a part of this, at least for the chunk of time.
It's not necessarily an abdication of responsibility that in a way it might be framed by social democrats, I guess, or people who are really,
or liberals, or
believe that the engagement in the politics is like all there is. But it seems like that's, that makes me think of your kind of a hippie upbringing, right? Is kind of like, there was this fight in the 60s and 70s that was, there were these circles of like hippies and counterculture people who thought, tune in, turn on, drop out, and kind of like remove yourself from the society and start communes and kind of create that reality. And people that were on the kind of more political side were disgusted by that idea, right? And thought that, they were essentially turning their back and using their privilege to turn their back. And, I'm sympathetic to both points of view, but I feel like maybe we need both. Yeah.
Yeah, I get. Yeah, I mean, I think it seems like it's like this really old question in political philosophy. Sort of quietism versus activism, and the life of withdrawal and quiet contemplation versus the active life, and whether politics is virtuous or if it's inherently if you're inherently selling out your humanity by joining the political realm. I feel like with a lot of things, just like with a lot of things, it's the conversation that's really important, and that maybe continuing to sort of like have this argument with oneself or with one's like friends or enemies, or that the question never really resolves, right?
Yeah, it makes me think of because like I think at the first Human Being in like 1967 in San Francisco, Allen Ginsberg and Timothy Leary were there, but there were also these kind of like political guys who were saying don't listen to them, but then there's a quote, and I hope I'm not getting it wrong. I think it's Tom Hayden, who was one of those political guys, who said later on that at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, when the cops were beating the shit out of everyone, it was total political chaos, that he saw Allen Ginsberg in Lincoln Park as he's like running from the cops. He sees Allen Ginsberg sitting in the lotus position meditating in the middle of the grass. And he said that image stuck with him because he thought that maybe that was the best response he saw to like of all the responses that people had to the like chaos of the cops and everything else. He still thinks like decades later that Allen Ginsberg meditating on the grass was maybe the most sensible response to all of that. And that story stuck with me because it still feels like we're gonna go through chaos like that in our history. And
oh my God. Yeah.
Meditation is that response of kind of like going internal seems like a logical one to me too. Yeah. Well, what were your parents' politics? I mean, did they take a side on this, or it seems like they were more?
No,
cultural in their kind of orientation? You mentioned your dad was like, in college. What was he studying? What was his thing?
Well, he dropped out of college after a semester.
Okay, yeah.
And he comes from sort of like, a long line of musicians, but then he grew up in this really post-industrial town in central New York State, an old factory town, and the factories were sort of dying when he was there. So he grew up with this sort of, and I think what I got from him was this sort of like angry working class politics.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
In all the ways that's ambivalent, right? That some ways it's sort of progressive and leftist, in some ways it's like really reactionary.
Sure.
Right.
Yep.
My mom grew up in a much different sort of social scene. She grew up in like Westport, Connecticut, and her father was an advertiser. He was a madman. And, like,
I was just gonna say Don Draper.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, he was a serious alcoholic. Who, it like. When I was watching Mad Men, I was like, "This is where my mom grew up," and like, this
wow, yeah.
But she was really much more socially committed. So like they met in New Mexico. I was born in New Mexico. And she, with some friends, started sort of a women's healthcare clinic. In the sort of Chicano part of town. And she was really active all through growing up. She worked for Planned Parenthood. So like when, in the 90s, when you'd see on the news, like Planned Parenthood surrounded by people, screaming about how abortion providers were going to go to hell and like throwing stuff, like that was my mom driving through that crowd to get to work.
This is like feminism in the 1970s.
Right. And so my mom was sort of intensely sort of second wave feminist.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in the like, in some of the more radical ends of that, like the red stock or I'm forgetting. Is it the red stocking?
I think so. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Or the blue stocking? No, it's the red stocking.
It's the red stocking. Yeah, I think it's red stocking. Yeah.
I'm getting the colors of the.
Someone's going to correct us on Twitter about that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But sort of intensely committed to women's liberation.
Yeah, and
I would also say a
building,
sort of Christian socialism.
So there's a Christian element to it.
Yeah, I mean, both my parents are very, very. They're sort of. I would say they're devoutly Episcopalian. That's an element of the hippie
phenomenon that I think a lot of people don't really think about all that much. Is that there was, the kind of religious element of the counterculture in the 1960s and 70s, and we think about kind of hippie spirituality being this kind of mishmash of Eastern mysticism and a bunch of other stuff, but I've known being from Southern California, I've known a lot of Christian influenced hippies, and surfing out here is a lot of Christians that surf, which is like all the surfer dudes at my high school were all the church guys. And
really?
Yeah, and like Laird Hamilton, who's like one of the biggest surfers in the world. He's a big Christian, and like it goes together. And I'm like, there's got to be a book about that. I mean, there probably is, but like the idea that
awesome book, Surfing for Jesus.
But I always thought that the connection to me, and I could be totally wrong, but it's something that I think goes along with what you're saying, which is that the kind of connection to nature that surfers have is a religious one, and it's one that kind of matches well with particularly American religious ideas. If that makes sense, you probably know a lot more about that than I do.
Well, I mean, I think coming through this sort of like Emersonian tradition, where nature and some sort of like not necessarily a doctrinal religion, but a sort of like sort of almost divine revelation kind of Christian religion and nature go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And for my dad, it was really through music. Like his father was a world-class organist and played in the church. And so for my dad, music was always sort of through the church. And he'll say to this day that like music is sort of God speaking through you, and he'll be like, I have played things that I could not, like I was not capable of playing, and it came out and it happened. And my only answer for that is that this was sort of God speaking through my fingers and my bass.
Yeah.
And I was sort of like, come on, Dad, don't you know that that's the opiate of the masses?
Right.
But yeah.
Well, so if you're saying, "Come on, Dad, that's the opiate of the masses," it sounds like you discovered like leftist kind of language at a certain point. Is that right?
Yeah, at a certain point. I mean, I think it was always just sort of there in the air in our house.
Yeah.
And especially my mom's sort of interpretation of what Christianity meant, and sort of in my dad's sort of like solidarity with working folks.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in like fourth or fifth grade, somewhere I discovered. I think it must have been at the school library. I discovered the Communist Manifesto.
At the school library. The FBI wasn't doing its job.
I may have, I probably have the date wrong.
Yeah.
Like maybe it was sixth grade, maybe it was seventh grade. I don't exactly remember. Basically, for as long as I can, for as far back as my memory actually works, I feel like I've had like phrases from the Communist Manifesto resonating in my head.
That's pretty incredible. Considering that a lot of people, especially I think Marx is probably getting discovered by young people at a rate that's higher now than maybe in previous generations. Yeah, so it's interesting to think about that idea, because I think a lot of young people are coming into Marx, in their 20s, and I probably encountered Marx, my late teens, somewhere in there. But it's funny to say like as far back in your memory, because that's like that's a different experience, I think, to have that stuff packed into you at a very young age like that.
Well, so I sort of discovered it young, and then read more Marx in college. I worked construction in between years of college, in the summers, and as much as I learned about like class identity and alienation of labor and primitive accumulation, all this sort of stuff, through reading Marx, it was really working construction, right? That and the guys I worked with, they were not Marxists. They could not quote, maybe had never heard of Karl Marx, but man, they knew the politics forward and backward. They didn't have the jargon for it, but they had the lived experience, and, could really tell you about what it meant to have your wages essentially stolen by your boss, right?
Yeah, right.
And, it was to sort of have those two experiences, the sort of book learning and then the sort of on the ground. It was really wonderfully eye-opening for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and that's something that's come up on this show before. There are some scholars and people that are in graduate school that have that experience, and some that don't. Yeah. Right? The contact with the working class, actually working blue collar jobs or Joe jobs, whatever you want to call that. That's important. I mean, for me, that kind of marriage of the theoretical with the lived experience is that the space between it is where you get the good stuff.
I think you're right. And it's like, I think the space between is where you get the good stuff. And it also highlights how big that gap between can be, right? Between the academy and the field, or whatever metaphors, sort of spatial metaphors you want to use.
So it sounded like you had like a whole bunch of ideas going into graduate school. I mean, how did you kind of attach like a project to this? And I know your book is really interdisciplinary. But you're a historian, right? Like you were kind of like in history departments in school.
I don't know. I mean, it's so funny. Like I don't know if you have this. I don't know if you have this experience. I'll answer your question, but I want to.
Yeah, totally.
Sort of
I think you are answering the question. Yeah.
So my experience of graduate school is that I loved it. Mm-hmm. I loved like 99.9% of it until I got to the job market, and then the job market extinguished nearly everything. Not only everything that I loved about graduate school, but it nearly erased for me the memory of why I wanted to go to graduate school in the first place.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And I was on the job market I was on for 7 years, but I was on kind of full-time for 5 years,
Yeah.
and just that, I have 2 kids, just that sort of grind of like, are we going to have healthcare next year?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
are we going to be able to buy you shoes, or like, how are we going to do this?
Yeah.
And
just that endless run. I mean, I've been in the job market for years. I mean, I basically just been adjuncting and then every fall putting in applications, but it gets to the point where it's like, it just doesn't seem like I'm pretty realistic about the fact that I'm not going to get a tenure track job at a history department. They're just not out there, and I'm not the guy they're going to hire. But yeah, that process is so demoralizing. It takes a lot to apply these jobs. Like there's you have to have letters of recommendation. Yeah, it really is like a full-time job. What they require. I mean, a lot of there are jobs that I've applied to that they wanted you to develop syllabi for classes.
Oh yeah.
Like literal.
And you have to get, to develop a good syllabus, you've got to be into it,
takes
right?
Forever,
so like I would be developing syllabus and be like, oh man, this book is going to be so awesome. And I'm like, I'm going to spend 5 hours figuring out which pieces of this book I'm going to teach and like blah, blah, blah. And then like, you're never going to teach that class.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's depressing, right? I mean, like your story is one I recognize, which is that I love the experience of graduate school. I went to graduate school because I wanted to learn. I wanted to share knowledge. I wanted to, really live that life that you kind of project of what an academic's life is like. But then, the realities of the job market completely destroy that. And, to now I'm like kind of creating, a career or a life, I guess, out of the bones of what I enjoyed from graduate school and my experiences there. And I'm still, teaching and things like that. And that keeps it alive in a way too. But how do you deal with the kind of, I don't know, I can get really angry about this stuff, and I can get really, demoralized because I have tons of student loans I'm paying off. And so
I'll never be free of student loans.
Yeah, and I'll literally be paying until the day I die for a degree that ultimately I'm not sure is gonna give me anything in exchange for, like getting a full-time job. So how do you deal with the emotional or psychological elements of that?
So one of the things that so I went to graduate school because I was deeply, deeply curious about everything.
Yeah.
And I loved to read. And I really wanted to be a writer. And I was lucky enough. So I went to Cornell for grad school, and Cornell was perfect for me. It's a very small program. And all of my advisors, when I would describe these weird combinations of things I was into, they were like, oh, great, do it. Like, let's do it. And they all had their own weird trajectories as well. And so it just felt like a good fit. And sort of what I realized, so a big, I don't want to give too much away, but a big part of the end of my book is that I got cancer right at the end of graduate school. Mm-hmm. And I got cancer actually at the same time that my wife was pregnant with our first child.
Wow.
And I remember going on this walk, like sort of after I was done with surgery and chemo and all that sort of stuff, and like, had my, 8-week-old kid, in the baby carrier. And I think I'd either already been on the market for one unsuccessful season, or I think I was coming up on my first unsuccessful season on the market. And I remember being like, all right, like if this cancer comes back, like what is it that I want to like look back on and be like, all right, I did what I can do. And what I really got to is that the most important thing to me was like my one child at that point. Now we have 2. And this book that I wanted to write. And the book is not a monograph. It's not a traditional academic first book. And that was a real problem on the job market. And I got plenty of feedback that like the book was not, it's different, and it's bad to be different. Right.
Yeah. Which is an amazing thing to say about academia, like that it would be bad to be different, right? Because it's supposed to be the space where we're exploring. Right? It should be the most really adventurous space.
It should be, but it's a discipline, and like all disciplines, one of the points of a discipline is to create disciples.
Yeah.
And disciples are not they're not diverse. That's not the point of being a disciple. That's not why disciples are created. So for me, the job market was, intensely angry and sort of intensely depressed. But sort of what I came to was actually failing out of the job market. Kind of gave me back this life that I had forgotten that I wanted, which was being a parent and being a writer. And if I couldn't find the freedom in the academy, I'm going to find that freedom somewhere, somehow. I'll let you know when I found it. But
I mean, you're explaining a lot of, I think, why I came to California, because I saw myself adjuncting in New York City and kind of living that life. And I thought to myself, well, if I can't have, a full-time job and I'm just going to be grinding on the subway, to 5 different campuses, right. I would rather do that in a space that I connect with, and that California to me is that what we started off talking about with the light and everything else is like, well, that's the life that I can imagine living and coming to terms with, instead of that grind. And it's amazing that you went through mortality becoming the kind of the kind of entryway to that's so scary, dude.
Well, it was terrible, and I don't recommend it to anybody.
No.
but in a lot of ways, it feels like it's sort of consonant with everything that's sort of going on.
Yeah.
At large right now, right?
Totally.
Like we live in a dying world.
Yeah.
There was just this study that they profiled in The Guardian today that since like 1970, 60% of the animal species in the world have died off, have gone extinct. Yeah. Right.
As I understand, we're in the most profound and prolonged mass extinction event in recorded history. Which is,
they're calling it
a bleak thing to think about at breakfast time.
That's right. Yeah. Like, hey, what are you going to do today? If you make it.
But you're right though. The mortality thing that you have like this kind of personal experience with is something that is mirrored in the whole culture, which is this death culture that Trump seems a part of, and everything else. This weird kind of really. I mean, it almost feels like we're involved in some religious ritual, mass religious ritual that has its own momentum, and we're just here to be caught up in the grinder of it. You really feel history at this moment, and mortality is a big part of it for sure.
Right. Well, it seems like capitalism has this death drive baked into it. Yeah. Right. To use up all the material sort of means of support, and convert them to profit for a very few people, sort of as quickly as possible. And I feel like probably every generation is like, well, I'm the last generation. Like everything's going to hell. This never. But like this feels different. Yeah. Right. Like the rise of fascism and authoritarianism throughout the world. The coupled sort of environmental degradation. Right. Brazil is now going to privatize apparently the Amazon to just sort of cut it as quickly as possible to plant soybeans and, whatever GMO crops to grow,
It feels like the Brazil thing feels like a death blow in a lot of ways. I mean, because a lot of my entryway into understanding the kind of planetary emergency was understanding the state of the rainforests, and not just the state of the rainforest, but the kind of, the barely held back like murderous intent of corporations in basically like using all of that really, and to me that gets at something really. There's the stuff I was reading early on was took that as a kind of spiritual thing, like you're talking about kind of like this death drive of capitalism, this kind of like why assault the kind of like most precious heart of our planet, that it seems like there's something so psychotic about it, and really,
absolutely,
really scary. Yeah.
And and the sad thing about it is I've started to feel that the people who are most serious about global climate change, on the mainstream and sort of mainstream politics, are Trump and his crowd. Right. Yeah. My read is that they're essentially like, all right, like resources are dwindling. We've got to gut things as quickly as we can and get out. And they're actually putting in policies to do this. Yeah. Right. Whereas sort of like the Democrats are like very good at wringing their hands and being like, oh, yeah, global climate change, that's a tough one, but it's just a non-starter with the voters, and like,
yeah, right.
maybe if we all just vote for Hillary Clinton, this will go away, and like,
we'll do another carbon tax, 1.5%.
We'll do another carbon tax, which failed, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it
just seems like a joke, though. Like a carbon tax, it seems like a joke. I mean, it seems like putting a Band-Aid on someone who's been shot 3,000 times with a machine gun,
Well, my understanding of it, in the Obama presidency is that it was, that the plan for the carbon tax was a lot like Obamacare, right? That sort of crafting policy that he thought the Republicans were going to get on board, right?
Right.
And then the Republicans like sort of were like, oh, Lindsey Graham was like, oh, just work with me a little more, make a few concessions, would make more, and then like yank the rug out right at the end and be like, ha ha, we fooled you again. Let's try this with your next policy proposal. And it just, I don't know. The future looks pretty. To me, it looks pretty dire.
Well, yeah, and that's partly an expression of what you just talked about, kind of like how much of a sick joke our political system is, and that's in part because it's part of the larger kind of capitalist assault on the planet. They're the managers of that. So how could we expect them to really do the transformative things that we need?
Right.
Which I don't know. We've talked about this on the show a lot. It's kind of like environmentalism and what that even means. What that even means in today's age, and what it has to do with tech, and what it has to do with like, I mean, I feel like in the 60s and 70s, the hippies were the kind of like forefront of the environmental movement. And they were suggesting a kind of degrowth, like kind of like stepping back from industrialization and going and going back to a more, what might be called primitive way of life. Where are you on all that stuff? Because I know it's like huge fights on the left between because like the socialists, like, they really believe in the power of industrial economy, and like their vision for the world is a teched out industrial place. And I'm always like, well, you've got the politics right of all of that, but it seems like that's a lot of the stuff that killed the planet. So maybe we got to find a way to live without that stuff. But they always are like, you've mentioned, that point of view would say, well, you're going to kill so many people by pulling back from industrialization. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's complicated. There's, I guess the sort of ways that I think one of the ways that American environmentalism fractures is along the lines of tech, right? Yeah. And so on the one hand, there's the sort of like Elon Musk version that like we'll just invent amazing things.
Yes.
No problem. Sure. Right. Done with it.
Yeah.
There's sort of like a more, and then there's sort of like, I think that eco-socialist vision, tends to sort of run along the, like you were saying, that like civilization is good, industrialization is good. It's, or it could be, I guess it's not inherently good, but like, right. If the workers own the means of production and all this sort of stuff.
We can't go backwards, basically.
We can't go backwards.
Yeah. Right.
Backwards is barbarity.
Yeah.
Right? And then sort of on the green anarchist front, there are a couple of different, versions, and one is that sort of post-scarcity anarchism, and that there's abundance all around us. It's just that the vast majority of us don't get much of a cut if we get any at all of that abundance, right? And then there's sort of like the anarcho-primitivist side, which is like civilization is pathology. This is sort of what James Scott's getting at in his newest book, right? Yeah. That really, if you want to talk about freedom, like the hunters and gatherers were the freest, right? And as soon as you start getting settled agriculture, you start getting the state, and if you're an anarchist, the state that's not what you want, right? My own, I wish I had I wish I knew what my own personal feeling. Like I'm much more on the anti-tech side of things.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that we're Skyping, I just bought my.
We're Skyping. We're podcasting. This is all going out on Twitter. This is
on Twitter.
Yeah, this is the paradox of our lives in a lot of ways.
It's the paradox of our lives. Yeah, and I do tend to fall. I think that there's a lot to admire in eco-socialism. I think some very smart people who are very committed and just really wonderful thinking.
Can you share a little bit of that tradition? Like, where does the eco-socialist tradition come from in America? I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of different answers to that question, but in terms of like what are you thinking when you say eco-socialism? Because I think there are a lot of people that are listening to this that are kind of like just discovering like the DSA, and things like that, and they're kind of like, well, what's eco-socialism?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess there are a lot of different ways to think about it and a lot of different trajectories, but sort of like the way that sort of socialism is like the best economy is an economy that's run by the actual workers themselves, right? Where the workers themselves make the decisions, sort of communally and share in the fruits of their labor equally and things like that. It sort of brings eco-socialism sort of brings in the environmental side of it, and in a way it comes out of Marx, right? Like in Capital, in the second book of Capital. That's where you start to get more of the ecological Marx. He calls it the metabolic rift, but it's all about the gap between the needs of production and the actual like resources, the natural resources that are available. And these, so eco-socialism, sort of brings these questions of like, who owns nature? We all, if it needs to be owned, we all sort of own it. It should be used in common as a common.
That's what I was going to think of. That concept of the common seems like something is a big part of that philosophy. Right. Is that,
but not that like libertarian commons, right? That like the commons needs to be privatized, otherwise the rude rabble is just going to ruin it.
Oh God, yeah. No, I mean it's like it feels like a more kind of I don't know, a more defined vision of whatever the hippie thing is this kind of recovery of something. This hippie thing that happens in the 60s and 70s is kind of I always see it as a kind of recovery of previous iterations of what nature is. And the in terms of Marxism, it's kind of like, that's, I think, a central way for me to explain Marxism in my classes. I tend to kind of create this vision of a society that's all like living by a river and using the river together, and then like one outsider comes up and says like, I own the river now, and I'm going to sell you that stuff. And when you put it that way, like just even I talk about bottled water, as like an example of that. And the students get it, like they get like, oh, okay, that's actually kind of a crazy idea, because what it means when you project that forward, like we actually bought that guy, that guy's system, and like that became the system for everything. Is that guy owns all of nature, and we pay him to use it, which is and pay him to use a like degraded, overpriced version of nature. And in that sense, it's nightmarish. Yeah.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right, and it's it's one of the things that's funny about watching Marxism become sort of popular, right? And like the rise of the DSA, which I'm really encouraged by. A little bit, I'm sort of like, what? Like how you never would have, in the 90s, like the idea that there would be like, outside of Burlington, Vermont, like that there would be socialists who like normal mainstream people voted for, like it would just sort of blow your mind, right?
Yeah, and that Bernie Sanders, who's been, a politician that I'm sure you've been aware of your whole life, and so have I, and I've always thought of him as kind of a sad like feature of our political system, is that there's this one guy from Vermont that's screaming about socialism for his whole life, and no one ever listens to him.
Right.
I mean, I when I was like a stoner dude in my 20s, hanging out with my friends, like whenever we didn't have hot water very often, and so whenever there was hot water, we were really excited, and we use the word Bernie. We'd say Bernie Sanders, like it would burn you, right? Like, and we thought it was kind of like this hip joke to know who Bernie Sanders was, like, and this was like 15 years ago, and now Bernie Sanders is like a household name and one who's associated basically with, I mean, literally for the policies of social democracy. Yeah.
Right. Well,
kind of crazy.
I think it just goes to show, like, that intuitively, some of the broad tenets of socialism and Marxism just sort of make intuitive sense, right? Mm-hmm. That like you don't have to read through all 3,000 pages of Capital.
It's those construction workers you mentioned.
Oh, wait, it's right. Like,
they get
if you work, shouldn't you get paid the full value of your labor? Like, who's going to say, nah, not really.
I'm good. Just take it.
I'm only worth a third of what my labor is actually bringing in.
Right. So yeah, in that sense, Bernie Sanders stuff, like, and I always thought this, he was like, just seemed so obviously right about everything he's been saying. And I mean that like right in kind of a narrow context of like what American politics are, but still, like everyone should be kind of on Bernie Sanders' side, but we're not, and that kind of tells you a little bit of how American politics works. Is that there are many other things, but you're right. I think that in the 90s, I think of the 90s as a very political time. I was like, but it was all like culture. I think of like third wave feminism and like punk rock stuff, and like I loved the 90s. I look back at the 90s, I'm like, that was like another flash of the kind of spirit you saw in the 70s and 60s. Right. But yeah, democratic socialism was not really on the.
It was not a thing. And you're right. Like, I don't know. I've been thinking about this, so like a lot of, so I like part of my trajectory coming to sort of like alternative or radical ideas was through punk rock. And like, that sort of punk resurgence in the 90s that like, you heard it, like it was popular, right? They're like, I mean, we can debate over like, was Green Day really a punk rock band? Right. Or when did they stop being a punk rock band?
Sure.
But like,
but it was there.
Like
and
when Dookie came out when I was in like 6th or 7th grade, I was like, whoa! And like for me, it was The Offspring, right? Like I was like, and then I got all the Offsprings earlier. I had tapes. Yeah, I got their earlier tapes, and I was like, whoa, The Offspring! And
I know, which are such like pop became like poppy mainstream fans. But I think that but you know what? But your example, like, is me too, in the sense of like, I'm really interested in the pop stuff because that's what gets to the ears that aren't necessarily converted to being hardcore punk people. And like I remember Dookie coming out too, and I was like a freshman in high school, and that one song, I forget the name of it, but there's a line in it where he says, my mom says to get a job, but she don't like the one she's got. That like snotty attitude of him. My mom said to get a job, she don't like the one she got. Like that made me. That was Marxism. Like that. Like literally was the beginning of me thinking about. Oh wow, people like that are adults that like work jobs. They didn't just like do this because they want to. It fucking sucks. Like the reality of like living your whole life and renting it out for a job. And that began. Dookie. People make fun of Green Day and be like, whatever, they're a mall band or something. But like, that stuff's important. And like those little, I'm very interested in those little cracks in the mainstream that are windows that especially 14-year-olds, boys and girls can find a different kind of POV. Yeah,
it's formative, and especially for me, right? So like, I grew up in the country. There weren't like, I mean, we could drive into, like I could have gotten my mom to drive me into Albany, New York to go see a punk show, but like that was never going to happen. That was never going to happen. So for me, a lot of it was like, once I had gone through the school library and, like read the Communist Manifesto and like gotten, checked out all the books on Martin Luther King, like whatever sort of like radical alternative, liberation stuff the school library would stock. After that, it was reading the liner notes of like, of bands and really like discovering Rage Against the Machine. Yeah. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
anarchy.
Rage makes an appearance on almost every show that's of people like my age. So you're about my age, and Rage Against the Machine. You know, we're talking to leftists that are this generation. It's kind of incredible how influential that became. And there's a really funny like Onion headline from a few years back that said like, you know, where are you now that we need you most? Rage Against the Machine. And it's kind of like, I know that's kind of a joke, but it's also like I take that 100% seriously.
But it's true.
Yeah.
I remember when I first started teaching I started teaching high school. I taught high school before I went to grad school in 2002. And at one point I said something like, "Do you guys listen to punk rock anymore?" And like the kids were like, "No, we don't listen to punk rock."
No.
And I was like, "Oh no, the youth is doomed." But now they're all socialists, so I don't, they got it somewhere.
Right. It doesn't have to be the music, but yeah. I mean, I indulge a little bit of Rage Against the Machine. I mean, you talk about like Dookie being like a little bit of political and social commentary within the otherwise kind of dopey lyrics, but like Rage Against the Machine were like literally like delivering the fucking news. And there's a song of theirs, Ashes in the Fall, that I play for my students a lot because it's like the end of it is him just screaming again and again like, ain't it funny how the factory doors close round the time that the school doors close, round the time that 100,000 jail cells open up to greet you like the Reaper. That I was like, whoa, like hearing that early on was like, this guy's connecting the mass incarceration, austerity and education, and just death, and in really just ways that you didn't really hear anywhere else.
Right. And it was on the radio. I mean, that was what was revolutionary, right? It was on the radio, right? For me, it was Testify, like that song Testify.
Yeah, totally.
I was just like, holy shit, like where this, like where have you been? Like it was revelation, right? And that it was everywhere, that they broke into pop culture.
And they,
and a lot of my friends are like, but they made $1 million and
there's all that, sure,
whatever, but like.
They captured the crime though of American history too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they were like they kind of connected like the stuff that was fucked up about today to like the whole history of America. And that's another place. I hadn't read Howard Zinn yet. You know what I mean? But I was grappling with the Howard Zinn ideas already from this pop band. Like they were it's funny that people would say, "Oh, they're so mainstream," but to me I think that's the key part of it. Is that they packaged like they took rap rock, which was like didn't last long as a genre, but I think
it turned into Linkin Park.
Yeah, like students now when you play them Rage Against the Machine, I think they recognize the lyrical power of it, but they're like, why the fuck is he like rapping with metal band? It sounds like it is a total product of the 90s.
Yeah. That's funny. We're totally dated.
Yeah, I know. Rage Against the Machine. I don't think they're literally going to come back. In fact, I watched a video of them like playing pretty recently. They came together and it just didn't have the fire. I mean, that's these moments happen and they go away, I guess.
Yeah.
So your book, I wanted to talk about it a little bit more before we're out. This book, This Radical Land, which is a history of, it's a natural history of American dissent. That's the subtitle, right? All those words, radical land, history, American dissent. Those words resonate very powerfully with the stuff we talk about on this show. So, what were you thinking when you kind of created the idea for this book? What was, how are you kind of framing this idea of dissent with nature?
Yeah, I mean, so, like a lot of like my novelist friends are always like, the novels I write are always autobiographical. And I think a lot of the sort of like nonfiction that we write is also sort of an intellectual autobiography.
Totally.
And for me, I was really trying to think through, on the one hand, feeling pretty alienated and dissatisfied with mainstream American capitalism, and looking for sort of an alternative tradition, and very interested in anti-capitalist politics, right? And so I just went, grad school was great. I read a zillion books and I loved it, And what I started to notice is that there were these different sort of like constellations of light happening of sort of anti-capitalist thinking happening in these different places all across the 19th century US. And, one of the intuitions I sort of had early on and sort of found in, one of the big green anarchists and social ecologists was named Murray Bookchin. And one of Bookchin's main points is that all environmental issues are also social issues, and all social issues are also environmental issues. And so that you can't have liberation for people without sort of like an honorable connection to the land, right? And we can't have a wholesome, honorable connection to the land if we have like a carceral society, right? If we have, that the problem is exploitation, and exploitation is neither just a human thing nor just a natural thing. It's all encompassing.
Yeah,
right?
I love that. Yeah.
And I started seeing all these people saying something similar across the 19th century US, but not just in the environmental world, right? In sort of these very different, what if we come to think of it, I guess, as intellectual trajectories. And so the point of this book, the book is sort of like 4 long essays that are set in different places, in different times, and in I guess you'd sort of say different subfields of American history. And they're all saying very similar things, right? There are lots of differences, but I think the thing that links each one of the essays and each one of the people that I'm talking about, or events that I'm talking about, is this key that the natural and the social are always linked, right? And that if you're going to have a social revolution, it has to have an environmental component to it, right? And vice versa, right?
I think that's a really powerful message for today. Considering, how we have like the IPCC report is telling us we have 20 years to do something. That 12. We have 12. So sorry, 12 years to do something. I can actually hear the ticking of the clock right now.
Yeah, I know,
in my head. But yeah, that idea that any transformation that we're going to have to make the endeavor of our lives is going to have to, I think, really consider hard those issues. And it seems like the history of the United States, and I think that's what I like about your work, is that the history of the United States has this grappling in it, that you've located a kind of through line in the kind of big thinkers and maybe not so well-known thinkers and events in American history that have always been grappling with this idea, because so much of American history is really about contending with nature, dominating nature, and then it would make sense that the counter to that would be the folks that are kind of saying, hey, the chunk of land that got colonized, North America, is a really, as ecologically rich place. I mean, the reason why America succeeded in like building global capitalism is because we took a chunk of land that was really worth a lot, resource wise. So yeah, I love that you've kind of located something that's kind of woven through the fabric of our history here.
Well, and and part of you asked a while ago, like if I was an historian, or how I went to
right.
And like I spent my PhD is in history. If Cornell had offered a degree in American Studies, I probably would have gotten.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or environmental humanities, I probably would have gotten that. I was trying to decide whether I should get a degree, in English. A lot of my, I work a lot in literary criticism.
Yeah.
But I guess for me, part of I've always had, ever since I was a little kid, a sort of historical turn of mind, and like whenever I sort of like look out at a question, any sort of problem or question of today, I'm always sort of like, I wonder what people were doing like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or like how do we understand this?
Yeah.
So to go into the archives and see that people have been asking the same questions we're asking now, like literally today, like how do authoritarianism and environmental degradation map onto each other? But that's a very old question, and that we can look to some of the wisdom and some of the failure of the past. And we don't have to invent these answers out of whole cloth, out of nothing for ourselves.
And you're your idea that you brought up just now about kind of how do we map the connections between authoritarianism and environmental degradation, I mean, that's Brazil right now, right?
That's Brazil, right? That's right this second. Right?
Yeah.
Like as of what, like 4 days ago or something.
Right. Is that we have the election of this fascist, which is something that I think a lot of people are rightfully concerned about, but that fascism connects directly to his policies and attitudes towards the rainforests, which are this vital part of, you talk about like a commons, a concept of like, I mean, these are the lungs of the planet. These are this is the kind of like such a vital part of the whole planetary ecology that to have one guy coming to Brazil. I mean, it's like a Vonnegut novel or something, like it would be comical if it weren't so just depressing and infuriating.
And as well, the Amazon too, as well, it's also sort of like sovereign territory of the various Amazonian people, indigenous folks who live there too, right? So again, we're seeing this like, first time is tragedy, second time is farce, third time is like, what the fuck are you thinking? Like we're seeing these same processes of colonization and imperialism and, like internal colonies and, genocide and displacement of natives, it's playing out again and again and again.
And in ways that like in the 90s, we kind of had this post-history feeling that like, that all the genocides and all that stuff is like stuff in the past, reading about the repopulation of the American plains by Native Americans in the 90s and the 21st century, is kind of incredible. That like a lot of people don't know that there are rising populations of indigenous people moving back to the American plains. In other words, the moment that the white settlers were there might be a kind of brief moment in the history of this continent, and then the Standing Rock and the fight. We have literally the state fighting Native protesters for the right to their water versus oil companies. That's stuff that we thought was done. I felt like the story of Native Americans being confronted violently by the American government on the plains was something that happened hundreds of years ago and is kind of this frontier story. But instead, it's happening like this second, and that's really. I think it makes your work even all the more important, dude. Like, there's well, thanks, and there's And there's this legacy that we can tap into, right? One of the really things that's interesting about Standing Rock and the water protectors, that it's Native-led, but it's especially Native women, right? Yeah. So there's this feminist aspect. It's sort of like feminist, eco-feminist, American Indian rights, all sort of combined in this really. I don't tend to be very hopeful about things, but there's something I think that's actually really hopeful about. I agree. These new collaborations that people on the ground are making, are putting into motion. Yeah, I'm with you. I don't tend to be super hopeful about the future. But at the same time, watching all of this happen, I see it as kind of maybe an expression of how desperate people are becoming and how aware people are coming. And the internet is educating people as much as it's also miseducating people and sending people into fascist conspiracies and everything else. There's also there's also people that are building things online. Right. So I think that. As much as I like to mitigate my thoughts about the future with my own kind of like sense of hopelessness, there's also I'm not the only person here, and the story's gonna. I know enough about history to know that the story's gonna go in directions that we don't anticipate. So
There's that Hannah. Hannah Arendt has this idea of natality, right? That natality is bringing something new into the world. Mm-hmm. She's talking a lot about art and ideas. Yeah. But when you just like bringing a child into the world. You don't know what that child is going to do, right? There's sort of this, this negative capability, this hope, Yes. But you also have to be very careful because you don't want your child to turn into Donald Trump, right? Right. And so that's as we are the parents. If we see, everyone alive on Earth right now are the parents of whatever is being born. How do we guide whether that's biological or intellectual or artistic or whatever.
Sure. And yeah, how do we guide that? Those are really great thoughts. Daegan, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, we should talk again. I feel like you and I have a lot to uncover, so we'll have you back on again. I really appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, cool, man.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody, I want to give a big thank you to my guest, Daegan Miller. I had a great time talking with him. I feel like we have so much more to talk about as the ecological crisis continues to unfold and all its connections to everything else. But check out his book, This Radical Land, A Natural History of American Dissent. It's an awesome piece, and I think it's a really unique kind of contribution to what we're thinking about here. So check that out. Go to nostalgiatrap.com. You can find bonus episodes, etc. And if you sign up for patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, become a patron of the show. We have all sorts of goodies for you over there. So go check that out if you want to more Nostalgia Trap content and to keep the content flowing. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. We'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.